The rich man's life was one of comfort and luxury. Every morning, he woke up in his grand mansion, greeted by a view of the sprawling city below. The soft light of the rising sun would filter through the massive windows, casting a golden glow on the marble floors. He lived alone, surrounded by expensive furniture, designer clothes, and the latest gadgets. There was no one to answer to, no one to take care of except himself. He would sip his morning coffee, sitting in a chair made of velvet, scrolling through emails on his phone, checking his investments, and making sure everything was running smoothly. His life was a routine of meetings, business deals, and dinners at five-star restaurants. Money was never an issue for him. It was everywhere, always in abundance. People admired him, not only for his wealth but also for his power. He was successful. Some would say, too successful. But despite everything he had, something was missing. Yet, he didn't know what it was. He'd never really given much thought to it. Life was busy, and there was always something more to achieve. He was used to seeing others in need, but it was something he simply ignored. Charity, kindness, compassion, they didn't matter to him. His focus was on his own world, his own goals. Other people's struggles were just background noise. As he left his house that morning heading to another meeting, he passed by the same street corner where the homeless woman always sat. The woman sat on the cold sidewalk, wrapped in layers of worn clothes. Her face was weathered, eyes tired, but still filled with a glimmer of hope. She had been on the streets for months, maybe longer. She wasn't sure anymore. Her life had been a series of bad breaks, one after another, until it led to this, a life of survival. She had a cardboard sign beside her, the words barely legible from the rain that had soaked it earlier in the day. "Anything helps," it read, in shaky handwriting. She held out her hand, waiting, watching the world go by. Some people didn't even glance her way. Others dropped a few coins in her cup, barely acknowledging her presence. Every day she sat there, hoping for a chance, a moment of kindness. But most of the time, it felt like no one saw her at all. Her stomach growled as she pulled the thin blanket tighter around her. She had barely eaten in the last 2 days. Every penny she received went toward getting something to eat, but it was never enough. It was always just enough to keep her alive, but not enough to change anything. She looked up as a well-dressed man passed by. He had a confident stride, his head high, focused on something ahead of him. For a moment, their eyes met. She held her breath, hoping. Maybe today would be different. Maybe he would help. But without missing a beat, he turned away and kept walking. He didn't even slow down. The rich man continued on his way, walking briskly down the busy street, his mind focused on the meeting ahead. He didn't look back, didn't think twice about the homeless woman sitting by the curb. After all, what was her life to him? She was just one of many he passed every day. People like her were everywhere, and he couldn't stop for every single person in need. There was too much on his plate, too much to do. He arrived at his office building, greeted by the sound of the elevator dinging as it ascended to the top floor. Inside, he sat down at his desk, scanning through reports and numbers. His work demanded his attention, and there was no room for distractions. He answered calls, made decisions, and signed papers, each one pushing his wealth and power further. Throughout the day, his life continued without interruption. Meetings, phone calls, more emails, it was all part of his routine. A brief moment of unease passed through his mind, but he brushed it aside. What had happened earlier? He couldn't remember. He was used to this. He ignored people like the homeless woman, just as he ignored everything that didn't benefit him directly. When evening arrived, he dined at his favorite restaurant, savoring a meal prepared by a world-renowned chef. The food was perfect, just like everything else in his life. The people around him were laughing, chatting, oblivious to the struggles outside. But in the back of his mind, that feeling from earlier persisted. A strange discomfort lingered, like something was out of place. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just a fleeting thought. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't escape it. There was a nagging feeling inside him, a discomfort that wouldn't go away. The next morning, the rich man woke up with a heavy feeling lingering in his chest. It wasn't the usual sense of accomplishment he was used to. No, today felt different. His luxurious bedroom, bathed in soft sunlight, suddenly felt a little too quiet. a little too still. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess, but the unease didn't leave him. He went through his morning routine like usual, brushing his teeth, drinking coffee, checking his phone for the latest updates. But something was off. There was a strange weight on his mind that he couldn't quite understand. As he got dressed in his tailored suit, he glanced out the window at the city below. It all looked the same, busy, bustling, perfect. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He left his house and headed toward his car, the streets of the city filled with the usual sounds of honking horns and rushing pedestrians. He passed the same street corner where the homeless woman had sat the day before. His eyes instinctively searched the area, expecting to see her there. But she wasn't. He looked around, confused. It wasn't like her to not be there, in the same spot, asking for help. Maybe she was just on a break, or perhaps someone else had given her a meal. He didn't know, but for some reason, he couldn't stop thinking about it. As he continued on his way to work, his mind kept drifting back to that moment. Where was she? Why hadn't she been there today? He found himself feeling uneasy, almost worried. But he quickly brushed it off. It wasn't his responsibility, after all. But that nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. As the day went on, the rich man couldn't focus. Meetings felt longer than usual, and every conversation seemed distant. His thoughts kept drifting back to the homeless woman. Where was she? Why couldn't he stop thinking about her? At lunch, he sat alone in his office, staring blankly at his phone screen. He couldn't get the image of her out of his mind, the way she had looked at him with those tired, hopeful eyes. He had ignored her. He had passed her by, like so many others, without a second thought. But now, in the silence of his office, he couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. It was as if something inside him had shifted, something he had been blind to before. His mind replayed the moment, her worn clothes, her outstretched hand, her eyes. Why hadn't he stopped? Why hadn't he done something? He had so much, and she had nothing. He had looked at her and dismissed her with a glance, thinking she was just another face on the street. But now, it felt wrong. He ran his fingers through his hair, frustrated with himself. How could he be so cold? He had everything, wealth, power, comfort, and yet he had refused to help. He felt his chest tighten as regret filled him. The more he thought about it, the heavier the guilt became. For the first time he felt something beyond his own world, something real, something human, and it hurt. It wasn't just about money or success. It was about compassion, about seeing others as more than just invisible people passing by. He had ignored her, but now he wanted to make it right. The thought of leaving things as they were, of moving on without doing anything, made him feel empty. He couldn't let it go. Determined to make things right, the rich man decided he couldn't let this go. He had to find her, to apologize, to help in some way. It wasn't just about money, it was about showing her that he saw her, that she mattered. He left his office early that day, ignoring the pile of tasks waiting on his desk. The streets were busy, the usual hum of city life all around him, but his focus was entirely on finding the homeless woman. He retraced his steps, heading to the corner where he had seen her yesterday. His heart raced as he scanned the area, but she wasn't there. He looked around, his eyes desperately searching every face, every figure sitting on the sidewalk. No sign of her. He asked a few people standing nearby, "Have you seen the woman who was sitting here yesterday? The one with the sign?" They shook their heads, their faces blank with indifference. No one seemed to know. He walked further down the street asking more people, but the answers were the same. No one had seen her. His frustration grew with each step. Where could she be? He couldn't understand why she wasn't there. It felt as though the city had swallowed her whole. The rich man's mind raced. What if something had happened to her? What if she had moved away, or worse, fallen ill, and couldn't make it back to the street? His chest tightened with fear. He couldn't bear the thought of leaving it unresolved. He couldn't bear the thought that she might be gone forever, that he would never get the chance to apologize, to offer her help. He spent hours searching. He walked from corner to corner, asking everyone he saw. His mind wouldn't let go of the thought of her, and the guilt continued to gnaw at him. The city felt different now, empty, distant. There were people everywhere, but he felt alone, disconnected from the world around him. The rich man didn't stop. He couldn't. Just as the rich man was beginning to lose hope, something caught his eye. It wasn't much, a shadow in the corner of his vision, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. He squinted, his heart suddenly skipping a beat. There, in a small alleyway, sat the homeless woman. She was different from the first time he had seen her. Her clothes were even more worn, her face more tired, as if time had weighed heavily on her in the short span of a day. But there she was, sitting on the cold pavement with the same cardboard sign next to her. Her eyes were closed, and her head rested against the wall behind her. The rich man's breath caught in his throat. He had found her. Without thinking, he walked over to her, his legs shaking slightly with nerves. As he approached, she looked up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met again. She didn't recognize him at first. Her gaze was distant, weary, but when he spoke, her eyes widened in surprise. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low but sincere. I should have helped you yesterday. I shouldn't have ignored you. I regret that. I was wrong." The woman blinked, a little taken aback by his sudden apology. She had heard apologies before, but they often came with excuses or pity. But there was something different in his tone, something real. "You don't need to apologize," she said softly, her voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. "I'm just trying to get by." "I want to help you," he said, his words coming out more urgently than he intended. "I can't just leave it like this. I have resources, a place for you to stay, food, a job, whatever you need. Please, let me help you." She stared at him for a moment, unsure whether to trust him. But there was something in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. A genuine desire to make things right. For a long moment they just stood there, their eyes locked. Then slowly she nodded. "All right," she whispered, "I'll trust you." The rich man couldn't believe how quickly things had changed. Just a few moments ago, he had been standing on the busy street, consumed with guilt and regret. Now here he was, offering the homeless woman a chance at a better life, hoping she would trust him. He led her to his car, the cold wind biting at their faces as they walked. She hesitated, but he gently reassured her. "You're safe with me. I'll make sure you're taken care of." They drove to a small, quiet shelter he owned, a place for those in need, though he had never personally visited it before. When they arrived, the woman looked around, her eyes wide with surprise. This wasn't just a shelter. It was clean, warm, and welcoming. She had seen shelters before, but none like this. The rich man led her inside, where she was given a room with a bed, fresh clothes, and a hot meal. For the first time in what felt like forever, the woman allowed herself to relax. She sat down on the bed, her tired body sinking into the softness of the mattress. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. She didn't know how to process it, how to understand that someone who had once ignored her was now offering her everything she needed. The rich man sat down next to her, watching her quietly. He felt a sense of peace in his chest, though it was mixed with an overwhelming feeling of relief. He had done something good, something right. And in that moment he knew he hadn't just helped her, he had helped himself too. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The rich man nodded. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing what should have been done a long time ago." The rich man returned to his mansion later that evening, but something was different. The house felt quieter, emptier, even though it was the same place he had called home for years. His luxury, his wealth, it all seemed distant now, like it was no longer enough. He had done something meaningful today, something that had filled a void he didn't even realize was there. His thoughts kept drifting back to the homeless woman. Her face, her eyes when she had first looked at him, those moments were now etched into his memory. The world had felt so small before, so focused on his own success. But now, everything seemed bigger, more connected. He had given something, but in return, he had received something far more valuable, a sense of purpose. He didn't need to be reminded of the expensive dinners, the meetings, the deals. He no longer felt the constant drive to acquire more. What mattered now were the people, the lives that he could touch with his actions. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he had been doing. How much he had been missing out on by staying within his own bubble, only concerned with himself. The following days were different. He began helping others, not just the homeless woman, but anyone who needed it. His wealth didn't change, but his perspective did. He was no longer just the man with the money. Now, he was the man who could make a difference.